My shift had just begun, and the warehouse was cloaked in its usual silence. I started my routine patrol through the massive, cavernous space, the only sounds being my footsteps echoing off the concrete walls and the occasional creak of old metal shelving. The warehouse, with its labyrinth of aisles and stacks of dusty crates, was as familiar to me as my home. But tonight, something felt off. A sense of unease settled over me as I descended the creaky stairs to the basement. The basement was typically cold and damp, but it felt freezing tonight. I brushed off the feeling as nothing more than an overactive imagination. After all, working the night shift in an old, abandoned building can do that to you. The basement was dark, illuminated only by the weak light from my flashlight. I methodically checked each corner and crevice, as I had done countless times before. The hum of the fluorescent lights above suddenly cut out, plunging the room into complete darkness. My flashlight beam cut through the void, revealing the familiar boxes and industrial equipment stacks. But tonight, something was different. As I swept my light across the room, I noticed a shadow moving independently. It wasn't cast by anything I could see, it just moved, almost as if it had a life of its own. My breath caught in my throat. I wasn't sure if my mind was playing tricks on me, but I knew what I saw. I took a deep breath and called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" My voice echoed off the walls, but there was no reply. The shadow continued its erratic dance, seemingly aware of my presence. Then came the footsteps, slow, deliberate, and uneven. They echoed through the basement, making my pulse quicken. I spun around, trying to locate the source, but there was no one. The footsteps stopped abruptly, and the shadow seemed to freeze in place. Suddenly, the lights flickered back on, bathing the basement in harsh, fluorescent light. I blinked, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The shadow was gone, but something else caught my eye. The objects in the basement had been moved. Crates that had been neatly stacked were now scattered haphazardly, and a few boxes had been toppled over. It was as if someone, or something, had been busy rearranging the place. My hands trembled as I walked through the disarray, trying to find some logical explanation. I checked the circuit breaker and the wiring, but everything seemed intact. I rubbed my eyes, thinking I must have been dreaming. But deep down, I knew that what I had seen was real. I finished my patrol, the feeling of being watched never leaving me. Each time I passed through the basement, I felt an oppressive presence, a sense that something was lurking out of sight. I tried to rationalize it, convincing myself that the old building's quirks were playing tricks on my mind. But as I locked up for the night, the unease stayed with me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that something dark and unseen was hiding in the shadows. And as I walked to my car, I couldn't help but wonder if tonight was just the beginning. The basement was absolutely dark. The sudden power outage had plunged the entire warehouse into an oppressive blackness. I fumbled for my flashlight, my heartbeat quickening with each passing second. Finally, the beam cut through the void, and the basement emerged from the shadows. That's when I saw it. A shadow. Any object or person didn't cast it. This shadow seemed to move independently. It darted across the walls and floor, shifting and writhing as if it had a life of its own. I squinted, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The dim light of my flashlight revealed nothing else. There were no discernible sources of the shadow or anyone else in sight. I took a few tentative steps forward, my flashlight beam following the shadow's erratic dance. The cold, dank air of the basement seemed to press in on me from all sides. The sudden flickering of the flashlight's beam was the only thing that kept the darkness at bay. I called out into the void, "Hello? Is anyone there?" The only response was a series of unsettling footsteps that echoed through the basement. They moved in circles around me, a constant reminder that I was not alone. I turned sharply, shining my flashlight in every direction, but each time I looked, the footsteps ceased, and the shadow was nowhere to be seen. My breath came out in sharp bursts as I tried to keep calm. I needed to understand what was happening. The warehouse had always been old and creaky, but this was the first time I had experienced something like this. I took another cautious step forward, my flashlight illuminating the scattered boxes and dusty furniture that filled the basement. Then, the lights came back on with a sudden flicker, bathing the basement in harsh, fluorescent light. I blinked rapidly, adjusting to the abrupt change. The shadow was gone, but what I saw next unsettled me. The basement had changed. All the items, boxes, tools, old machinery, were in different positions from where I had last seen them. It was as if someone had been moving things around, or worse, someone had been trying to rearrange the entire basement. My flashlight beam swept over the scene, highlighting the disarray. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe the power surge had triggered something, an automatic system that might have caused the movement. But the more I looked at the chaotic state of the basement, the more I felt a creeping dread. I knew I hadn't been gone long enough for this disturbance to occur. I returned to the control room, trying to calm my racing thoughts. My mind replayed the events in the basement, the shadow, the footsteps. I wanted to believe it was just a trick of the darkness or an issue with the electrical system, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The control room was quiet, and the faint hum of the backup generators provided some comfort. I reviewed the security footage from the basement, but the outage affected the cameras, showing nothing but static. I felt a pang of frustration. I needed concrete evidence to explain what had happened. As I prepared for my next round of patrols, I resolved to be more vigilant. I would get to the bottom of whatever was going on in the basement. The sense of being watched, of something lurking just beyond my sight, was not something I could ignore. I knew I had to face whatever was disturbing the warehouse, no matter how unsettling it might be. My shift continued, and an uneasy feeling settled over me. Each creak of the building seemed amplified, each shadow more sinister. I was determined to discover what was happening in the old warehouse, even if it meant confronting fears I could barely comprehend. As I stepped back inside, the basement was cold and quiet. After the lights had flickered back on, I quickly scanned the area. Everything seemed in disarray. Boxes were scattered and tools were displaced. I'd checked the circuit breaker, but it was functioning normally. Nothing seemed unusual except for the unmistakable feeling that something was wrong. The unsettling feeling of being watched wouldn't leave me. Every creak of the old wooden floorboards and every whisper of the wind outside seemed amplified. I couldn't shake the sensation that someone or something was observing me from the shadows. Determined to discover what had happened, I returned to the basement the next night, armed with a digital camera and a notebook. I wanted to document everything meticulously. The basement, with its high shelves and cluttered corners, was the perfect setting for a horror story. The old warehouse had seen better days, but my responsibility was now to ensure everything was secure. I started by reviewing the footage from the security cameras I had installed in the basement. To my disappointment, the footage was as mundane as ever. Nothing out of the ordinary appeared, just the occasional movement of a shadow as the cameras adjusted to the dim light. I frowned, feeling a pang of frustration. I decided to conduct a systematic search. I approached the corner where I had seen the shadow the previous night. My flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing dusty old crates and forgotten furniture. As I moved, I checked each object and corner meticulously. I was looking for anything that might explain the disturbances, loose wires, hidden mechanisms, or even some practical joke someone might have played. Around midnight, the air grew colder. My breath began to form clouds in the beam of my flashlight. I paused, listening. The footsteps I'd heard seemed to echo faintly in the distance. I could feel a shiver run down my spine. I couldn't ignore that the noises and movements seemed to be occurring in a pattern. It wasn't random. There was something deliberate about it. The following nights, the pattern became more apparent. The disturbances occurred roughly at the same time each night, around midnight. It was as if something was waiting for that precise moment to act. The objects in the basement continued rearranging, and the shadows seemed to grow longer, more menacing. I began to make a detailed log of the activities. I noted the time and date each time something moved or a shadow flickered. The more I documented, the more I noticed that the occurrences followed a repetitive pattern. Particular objects were always disturbed in a specific sequence. The shadows always seemed to appear in the same places. One night, I stayed in the basement longer, hoping to catch whatever was causing the disturbances. I set up additional cameras in the corners where I had previously seen the shadows and placed motion sensors throughout the room. The air was thick with tension as I waited in the dark, listening to the creaks and groans of the old building. Around midnight, the temperature dropped sharply. My breath fogged up in front of me, and I could hear the unmistakable sound of footsteps. I turned my flashlight toward the source, but there was nothing visible. The cameras picked up a faint, shifting shadow, but it was too indistinct to make out clearly. The feeling of being watched grew more intense. My skin crawled, and I could hardly concentrate on anything other than the oppressive weight of the presence in the room. I decided to call it a night, knowing I needed more information to understand what was happening. As I packed up my equipment, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, lurking just out of sight. The disturbance patterns were becoming more apparent, but the answers remained elusive. I needed to learn more about the warehouse's history and any previous reports of strange occurrences. I hoped that understanding the past might shed light on the unsettling events unfolding in the present. When I returned, the basement was dark, the usual dim lighting replaced by the unsettling blackness that seemed to seep into every corner. The light had flickered back on just moments before I left, but the feeling of unease lingered, growing stronger with each step I took into the basement. The heavy silence was occasionally broken by the faint hum of the warehouse's machinery upstairs, but it felt like time had stopped down here. I turned on my flashlight and scanned the room, my eyes falling on the scattered objects and boxes that had been moved. It was clear that something, or someone, had been here. My first instinct was to check the electrical panels, but everything seemed to be in order. No signs of malfunction or faulty wiring were evident. The lights flickered off again, and I cursed under my breath. The basement plunged back into darkness. I fumbled for my flashlight, its beam cutting through the oppressive blackness. As I adjusted the light, I saw the shadow again. It was a dark, amorphous shape that moved with unnatural fluidity. I blinked several times to convince myself I wasn't imagining it. The shadow seemed to drift aimlessly, shifting and changing shape with every flicker of my flashlight. The sensation of being watched was overwhelming. I felt eyes on me, though I saw nothing. I moved cautiously, my flashlight sweeping across the basement. The footsteps I had heard earlier returned, echoing around me. They were disembodied, neither fast nor slow, but erratic and unpredictable. I turned sharply, but there was no one there. My breath quickened as I rechecked the area. Every time the light flickered back on, I hoped to find some rational explanation, an open window letting in the wind, a loose object that had fallen, but the basement remained in disarray each time. The heavy wooden crates, once neatly stacked, were now haphazardly overturned. Old machinery was displaced, and tools lay scattered as if someone had quickly rifled through them. Determined to find an explanation, I scrutinized every corner of the basement. I noticed a draft coming from a small ventilation grate on the far wall. It was loose, and the cold air felt unusually intense. I removed the grate and shone my flashlight into the narrow space. It was empty, just a tiny duct leading out of the building, but the cold air was inexplicable. I decided to set up a camera in the basement to monitor any further disturbances. I carefully placed the camera in a corner where I had seen the most activity, hoping to capture whatever was causing these strange occurrences. I also set up a motion detector and a small tape recorder, which I left running in the hopes of capturing any unusual sounds. As I finished setting up the equipment, the lights flickered once more. My flashlight momentarily dimmed, and I saw the shadow moving again. It was approaching me, its form shifting and growing more defined. My heart raced, and I felt a cold sweat on my forehead. I had no choice but to face this head-on. With a deep breath, I stood still and watched the shadow. It moved with an unsettling deliberation, seeming to study me as much as I was learning it. The basement felt colder, the air thick with tension. I braced myself for whatever might come next, my footsteps echoing in the stillness. The shadow seemed to stop moving, and for a brief moment, everything was still. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was on the verge of discovering something significant that might explain the strange occurrences and the oppressive feeling that had taken hold of me. The minutes ticked by, each stretching into eternity as I waited for the next event, hoping to find some answers to the growing mystery of the basement. The lights flickered back on, bathing the basement in a harsh fluorescent glow. I stood there, my flashlight trembling, scanning the room for movement. My heart pounded as I took in the chaotic scene before me. Tools, boxes, and other supplies had been scattered and upended. It was as if a tornado had swept through the space, yet the air was eerily still. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. The footsteps I had heard and the shadow that had moved on its own were still fresh in my mind. I was supposed to be patrolling, not investigating supernatural phenomena, but the sense of unease was undeniable. It was as though an invisible presence had marked me as its target. As I carefully approached the disheveled pile of objects, I noticed a peculiar pattern in the arrangement. It wasn't just random chaos. There seemed to be a deliberate disturbance, perhaps a message. I tried to focus, looking for anything out of place or any sign that might explain what had just happened. There were no visible signs of forced entry, and the basement's security cameras were down during the blackout. I spent the next hour methodically tidying up and checking the equipment. Now and then, I caught myself glancing over my shoulder, feeling my eyes were dull into the back of my head. I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was lurking just beyond my sight. An unsettling routine marked the next few nights. The same eerie feeling of being watched would return each time I patrolled the warehouse. Though functioning, the lights in the basement flickered sporadically, and the shadows seemed to dance on the walls just out of the corner of my eye. The more I tried to rationalize it, the more unnerved I became. I thoroughly inspected the basement to find a more logical explanation. I checked the wiring, looking for any signs of faulty connections or loose fixtures that might have caused the blackout. Everything seemed to be in order. No wires were frayed or disconnected, and the circuit breakers usually function. It was as if the problem had resolved itself without leaving any tangible evidence. The rearranged objects continued to baffle me. I even questioned the possibility of a prank, but it didn't add up. The basement was too remote and secure for anyone to access without leaving some trace. The feeling of being watched intensified, and the more I investigated, the more I felt like I was stirring up something best left alone. Desperate for answers, I started keeping a log of the disturbances. I documented the flickering lights, noises, and any other strange occurrences each night. My notes revealed a disturbing pattern. The disturbances happened simultaneously each night, with the worst episodes occurring around the same hours. I decided to take a proactive approach. I set up additional cameras around the basement, hoping to capture any evidence of the shadow or the footsteps that had haunted me. I also increased the frequency of my patrols, aiming to be present during the hours when the disturbances were most likely to occur. Despite my efforts, the unsettling feeling never left me. Each night, as I walked the darkened corridors of the warehouse, the shadows seemed to grow longer and more ominous. The basement, once a routine part of my job, had become a source of constant anxiety. I could no longer ignore the creeping suspicion that something was wrong in that place. I knew I needed to find answers, and I knew that the longer I put it off, the more the shadow in the basement would continue to haunt me. As I headed into the darkness for another night of patrolling, I braced myself for whatever lay ahead, hoping the cameras would finally provide the answers I desperately needed. Since that first night in the basement, the warehouse has taken on a life of its own. Every shift, I dreaded the descent into the dark, damp expanse where shadows seemed to slither and dance with a will of their own. I checked the electrical systems and the basement for any issues, but everything was in order. It was time to start looking for patterns. Each night, I made detailed notes of everything that happened, the flickering lights, the eerie shadows, and the unnerving feeling of being watched. I began to notice a troubling pattern. The disturbances in the basement followed a specific schedule. The lights would go out around the same time each night, the shadow would appear almost predictably, and the rearrangement of objects always seemed to occur in the same general areas. Last night, I decided to experiment. I waited for the lights to flicker out, as they inevitably would. When darkness fell, I used my flashlight to navigate the basement, determined to catch a glimpse of whatever was causing the disturbances. I strolled, shining the beam across the space, but the shadow was elusive. It was as though it knew when to hide. Reviewing the footage from the cameras I had set up earlier, I saw that the shadow seemed to follow a specific path through the basement. It started near the old storage racks, moved past the crates, and then disappeared into the far corner where the old furnace stood. It was almost as if the shadow had a deliberate route it followed every night. Armed with this new information, I focused on areas where the shadow seemed to linger. I spent a few nights near the furnace, determined to catch whatever was causing this phenomenon. Each time the lights went out, I would scan the area with my flashlight. but the shadow remained frustratingly out of reach. On one of these nights, I heard the footsteps again, louder and closer than before. I froze, holding my breath, and listened intently. The footsteps seemed to move around the furnace, circling it like something or someone was pacing. My flashlight flickered wildly, casting erratic beams of light that only heightened my dread. With a deep breath, I moved closer to the furnace. The air around it was colder than the rest of the basement, and I could see my breath fogging up in the dim light. As I peered into the darkness, I noticed something unusual. A small, hidden panel was on the wall behind the furnace, almost as if it had been deliberately concealed. My heart raced as I approached the panel and carefully pried it open. Inside, I found a dusty old box that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. I hesitated for a moment, then opened the box. Inside was a collection of old photographs, documents, and what appeared to be some personal items, a watch, a ring, and a few letters. I sifted through the items, trying to make sense of them. The photographs depicted the warehouse in its early days, with people standing in front of what looked like construction equipment. Some of the faces were familiar, former employees perhaps, or workers who had been here before. One photograph showed a group standing before a large machine, looking severely and somewhat worried. The letters were from John Matthews, who seemed involved in the warehouse's operations. The letters mentioned problems with the machinery and complaints about the working conditions. One particular letter was a desperate plea for help, mentioning unexplained phenomena and a growing fear among the workers. It dawned on me that these items might be connected to the disturbances. John Matthews could have experienced these strange occurrences, and his concerns about the warehouse's machinery might be linked to the shadow I was encountering. I knew I needed to dig deeper. The connection between the shadow and these old documents became more apparent, but I needed more information. I decided to investigate John Matthews further and see if there were any records or additional details about his time at the warehouse. As I left the basement that night, I felt trepidation and anticipation. The discovery of the box had provided new clues, but it also meant that there was more to uncover. The shadow in the basement was no longer just a fleeting disturbance. It was a piece of a giant, darker puzzle that I was determined to solve. I had never believed in ghosts or supernatural occurrences, but the events of the past few nights had me questioning my own sanity. Each evening, as I made my rounds through the old warehouse, the unease grew. The shadow I had seen in the basement seemed to have a pattern, a rhythm that I couldn't quite understand. It started small. I would find objects slightly out of place, nothing too dramatic, just enough to make me pause and wonder if I had missed something. As the days passed, the disturbances became more pronounced. Tools were scattered across the floor, and crates that had been neatly stacked were now toppled over. Each time, I meticulously put everything back in order, only to find it in disarray again the following night. One evening, as I walked through the darkened warehouse, I decided to pay closer attention to the peculiarities. I focused on the basement, where the lights had flickered out before. I set up a couple of additional motion sensors and cameras to capture something, anything, that could explain the bizarre occurrences. The basement was colder than the rest of the warehouse, and the air seemed to crackle with a strange tension. I tried to ignore the goosebumps forming on my arms as I completed my tasks. The shadowy figure had left me feeling on edge, but I had resolved to uncover whatever was causing these disturbances. Around midnight, I noticed something curious while monitoring the feeds from my newly installed cameras. There were moments when the motion sensors picked up movement in specific areas of the basement, always around the same time. The shadow I had seen seemed to drift between these locations, almost as if following a predetermined path. I reviewed the footage from the past few nights. There were indeed patterns, flickers of shadow and brief moments of movement that didn't correspond with anything I could see in the physical world. It was as if the basement itself had a life of its own, responding to an invisible force. The most unsettling part was how the disturbances seemed to increase in frequency. I could no longer dismiss them as coincidences or my imagination playing tricks. The basement had become a focal point, and the feeling of being watched had intensified. It was as if whatever was causing these disturbances was growing bolder, more desperate. Determined to investigate, I spent a night in the basement. I set up several more cameras and placed additional sensors at critical points. I also brought a few extra flashlights, a notepad, and a voice recorder, hoping to capture any sounds or voices that might provide clues. The hours passed slowly, each minute stretching into an eternity. The basement was eerily silent, save for the occasional creak of the old building. The shadow, almost living in my mind, seemed to hover just out of sight. I felt a cold draft, and the temperature dropped noticeably, adding to the oppressive atmosphere. The sensors picked up movement around 2 a.m. My heart raced as I watched the footage in real time. The shadow appeared again, drifting between the crates and shelves. This time, however, it interacted with the objects more deliberately. Boxes and tools were moved as if handled by an unseen hand. I tried to keep my composure as I recorded everything. The sight was both mesmerizing and terrifying. The shadow was methodical, as though it was following a specific routine or perhaps trying to communicate something. The night dragged on, and as the first light of dawn began to creep through the high windows, the disturbances ceased. The basement fell into its usual quiet state, and the cold draft disappeared. I reviewed the recordings once more, noting every detail, every movement. Clearly, the basement was not just a backdrop for these disturbances, but a key player in the mystery. The pattern was undeniable, and the sense of being watched was ever present. Whatever was causing these disturbances was deeply tied to this place, and it was becoming increasingly evident that I needed to dig deeper into the warehouse's history to find the answers I sought. As I left the basement, the night's events weighed heavy on my shoulders. I knew I was getting closer to uncovering the truth, but the uncertainty of what lay ahead made me anxious. The shadow was no longer just a fleeting image. It had become a tangible presence, and I was determined to confront it. The weeks following the shadowy encounter in the basement were filled with a growing dread. Every night, as I walked the dimly lit corridors of the old warehouse, I couldn't shake the feeling that something unseen was following me. The once familiar environment now felt alien and menacing. I began to notice a pattern in the disturbances. It wasn't just random. It seemed like the basement events followed a specific routine. The lights would flicker out simultaneously, and the shadow would appear in the same corners. The rearrangement of objects, which initially seemed chaotic, began to take on a deliberate order. Determined to investigate, I decided to document the occurrences more systematically. I set up a series of motion-activated cameras in the basement and other key areas of the warehouse, positioned to cover every angle of the basement, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever was causing these disturbances. The first night of recording provided little evidence. The cameras picked up nothing more than the occasional dust motes and the creak of the old building. I reviewed the footage with hope and frustration, knowing that if something existed, it would be elusive. By the end of the second week, I'd compiled hours of footage, but the results were disheartening. The cameras recorded only shadows and movements that the wind or settling of the building could easily explain. But I couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something was still off. Then, during my routine inspections, I found something that confirmed my suspicions. In the corner of the basement, behind a stack of old crates, was a piece of paper with strange symbols scribbled. It looked ancient, worn, and out of place. I recognized some symbols from the warehouse's history, rumors of old superstitions and rituals. The unsettling symbols suggested there might be more to the warehouse than faulty wiring and old machinery. The discovery of the paper added another layer to the mystery. Whatever was causing the disturbances in the warehouse seemed to be connected to something deeper, something that went beyond mere technical malfunctions or simple pranks. As I continued my investigation, I couldn't shake the feeling that the patterns I saw were intentional. The shadow appeared at specific times, objects were moved in a particular order, and the disturbances seemed to follow a rhythm. It was as if someone or something was trying to communicate or make a point. The next step in my investigation was to delve into the history of the symbols I had found. I visited the local library and scoured old records and books about the warehouse and its origins. I learned about local legends and folklore, some mentioning haunted places and curses linked to old warehouses and abandoned sites. Despite my efforts to find a logical explanation, I was starting to believe that the disturbances in the warehouse were more than just a series of coincidences. They were part of a more giant, more complex puzzle. As I reviewed the latest footage that night, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. In one of the clips, just before the lights flickered out, a shadowy figure appeared in the corner of the frame. It was fleeting, barely visible, but it was unmistakably there. It seemed to be watching, waiting. I leaned back in my chair, my mind racing. The pattern was clear. The shadow wasn't random. It was purposeful. Whatever was causing these disturbances had a reason, and it was time for me to confront it directly. I prepared for another night in the warehouse, knowing that the subsequent encounter might be the key to uncovering the truth behind the shadow in the basement. The warehouse had always been a place of routine, its creaking floorboards and musty smell as familiar to me as my own shadow. But everything had changed since that night when the lights went out and the shadow moved independently. I could no longer ignore the growing unease that had settled over me like a heavy fog. Determined to understand what happened, I dig into the warehouse's history. If there was a rational explanation for the disturbances, I needed to find it. I began my investigation by sifting through old records and talking to the previous security guards. Most of them had left abruptly or refused to discuss anything out of the ordinary, but one of them, a man named Jack Sullivan, was willing to talk. Jack had worked here for over a decade before retiring and was more than willing to share his experiences. Over coffee, he spoke of strange occurrences he'd witnessed, particularly in the basement. Sometimes, he said, leaning in with a conspiratorial whisper, the lights would flicker, and you'd hear footsteps, even when you were alone. But no one ever talked about it. His words confirmed my suspicions and made my skin crawl. Did you ever find out what was causing it? I asked. Jack shook his head. Never figured it out. Some said it was just the old building settling. Others thought it was something more. I'd tell myself it was my imagination and move on. I needed more concrete information, so I spent the next few days combing through the warehouse's historical archives. I uncovered reports of accidents, strange occurrences, and even a few unsolved cases related to the warehouse. One report mentioned a fire that had broken out in the basement decades ago, resulting in a tragic loss of life. A malfunctioning electrical system reportedly caused the fire, but the investigation was inconclusive. Several workers had disappeared under mysterious circumstances, and rumors of hauntings had surfaced shortly after. I found a few old newspaper clippings with headlines about the warehouse being cursed and sightings of apparitions, but nothing that could be definitively linked to the disturbances I was experiencing. I returned to the warehouse with a renewed sense of purpose with this new information. I set up additional cameras and motion sensors in the basement, hoping to capture any unusual activity. I also marked the areas where I had noticed the disturbances and planned to monitor them closely. Walking through the dimly lit corridors, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The shadows seemed to move just out of the corner of my eye, and the echoes of footsteps followed me wherever I went. The basement was particularly unnerving, its darkness pressing in from all sides. I double-checked the cameras and motion sensors, ensuring everything was in place, before retreating to the security office to review the footage. The hours dragged on, and my fatigue began to set in. I replayed the footage from the basement, watching for any signs of movement or anomalies. The cameras captured nothing unusual, but the unsettling feeling that something was lurking in the shadows persisted. I reviewed the footage repeatedly, searching for clues explaining the strange occurrences. Around midnight, I decided to take a break and stepped outside to get some fresh air. As I walked around the building, I noticed a figure in the distance standing near the entrance to the basement. I squinted, but the figure was gone before I could get a closer look. My heart raced as I hurried back inside, feeling a surge of fear and urgency. The following day, I again examined the footage and saw something that made my blood run cold. On one of the camera feeds, there was a brief but unmistakable glimpse of the shadow I had seen the night the lights went out. It was fleeting, almost as if it was aware of the camera and deliberately avoiding it. The shadow moved quickly, slipping in and out of view and disappearing. I knew I was on the brink of uncovering something significant. The shadow, the strange occurrences, and the history of the warehouse all pointed to something deeply unsettling. I had to find out what was lurking in the darkness before it was too late. The chill in the basement seemed to seep into my bones as I patrolled the old warehouse again. The unease from previous nights had turned into a relentless anxiety. Ever since that first encounter with the moving shadow, I had been haunted by the feeling of being watched, as if something, or someone, was lurking just out of sight. I had done everything in my power to find a rational explanation. I checked the electrical wiring, ensuring there were no short circuits. I even brought in a technician, but he saw nothing to be fixed. Yet every night the disturbances continued. Tonight I was determined to catch whatever was causing the disturbances. I had set up several security cameras and motion sensors throughout the basement. The cameras were connected to a monitoring system in the control room, giving me a live feed of every basement corner. As I descended into the basement, I felt a familiar shiver. The overhead lights flickered intermittently before settling into their usual dimness. I scanned the area with my flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. The piles of boxes and old equipment cast eerie shadows against the walls. I waited in silence, my flashlight trained on the spot where I had seen the shadow move. The air was heavy, and every sound seemed magnified. The occasional creak of the building settling made me jump. I focused on the camera feed, watching for any signs of movement. Hours passed with nothing out of the ordinary, but just as I was about to give up, I noticed something on the monitor. One of the cameras picked up a dark shape moving across the screen. My heart raced as I watched the shadow drift slowly across the basement floor. It was as if it were gliding, completely unaffected by the room's physical constraints. I grabbed my flashlight and rushed to the camera's location. The basement seemed emptier than ever, the shadow having vanished as quickly as it appeared. I checked the area, but there was no sign of movement. Frustration began to gnaw at me, and I felt helpless. Why was this happening? I decided to review the footage from earlier in the night. I fast-forwarded through hours of static and mundane activity until I saw it. The shadow appeared, and this time it seemed to take on a more defined shape. It moved toward a particular corner of the basement where I had noticed a slight disturbance in the dust. I went to that corner with renewed determination and began moving the boxes and equipment. I found an old, rusted metal box underneath a stack of old crates. It was locked, and the lock looked ancient. I managed to pry it open with a crowbar, my hands trembling with anticipation. Inside the box were old documents, photographs, and a journal with faded ink. I carefully opened the journal, and the first entry I read described a man named Henry Turner, who had worked in this warehouse decades ago. The entries detailed unfortunate events and a deep sense of paranoia. Turner had been convinced that someone, or something, was watching him from the shadows, a feeling that eventually drove him to madness. As I read further, I discovered that Turner had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. The final entries were frantic, mentioning a dark presence that had taken over the warehouse. The writing stopped abruptly, leaving the rest of the pages blank. Suddenly, the basement temperature dropped sharply. I could see my breath in the cold air. I looked up, and the shadow was in the corner of my eye again, more distinct and menacing than before. It seemed to be forming a figure, its presence more tangible and oppressive. I stood frozen, the shadow advancing toward me. It felt as though the air around me was thick with malice. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the shadow dissipated, leaving me with the journal and the chilling remnants of Henry Turner's last days. The revelation struck me with a mix of fear and clarity. The shadow wasn't just a supernatural entity. It was a manifestation of Turner's lingering torment, a dark echo of his tragic end. I had uncovered the truth, but the feeling of being watched persisted. I knew that the presence was tied to the history of the warehouse, an unfinished story of fear and madness. As I left the warehouse for the last time, I took the journal, determined to share its story. The shadow may have been a remnant of the past, but the truth finally came to light. The warehouse's dark history would no longer be hidden in the shadows.